When scholars look back across the long and troubled ages endured by humanity, only fragments of the Emperor's wider design for the galaxy can truly be grasped. Some believe that each of the great Space Marine legions created during the first founding was shaped with a particular purpose in mind, and in many cases the conduct and character of those legions seem to support that quiet assumption. The Imperial Fists stood as the Emperor's steadfast Praetorians and unyielding champions, while the Ultramarines marched as dutiful and resplendent hosts, spreading order across the stars. The 19th Legion, however, would come to occupy a far more subtle place within that grand design. They became the hidden hand of the Emperor, silent sentinels who watched the disobedient and hunted those who would rather flee into darkness than kneel before the new Imperium. In its earliest years, the Proto-Legion drew heavily from the harsh cultures of Old Earth, recruiting warriors from the techno-savage tribes who survived within the desolate Asiatic dust fields. These tribes lived by constant struggle over scarce resources, and their way of war shaped the character of the Legion that emerged from them. From the very beginning, the warriors of the 19th Legion displayed an uncanny talent for patient observation and silent movement, studying their enemies from afar before unleashing swift and decisive violence at the precise moment it would matter most. Their method of war rarely announced itself with banners or thunder. Instead, the legionaries slipped unseen into hostile territory, watched and learned, and waited until the instant when their enemy felt most secure. Only then would the blow fall, sudden and lethal, delivered from directions no defender had expected, and finished in a brief storm of blood and silence. During the last struggles of the Unification Wars, many foes believed they could defy the Emperor and hold their ground against the coming order. That confidence often lasted only until the moment the 19th Legion revealed itself, already positioned as though a weapon had been quietly raised against the temple of its target, without the victim ever noticing the assassin's approach. Faced with such invisible pressure, many enemies chose surrender rather than ruin. The Legion was not driven by needless cruelty, and the Emperor's emissaries would present their targets with a simple choice. They might kneel and accept the Imperium's rule, or they could stand and be destroyed by the force already waiting in the shadows. When resistance persisted, the Legion advanced without warning, emerging from concealment to strike with speed that allowed small forces to overwhelm armies far larger than themselves. Their campaigns often began with careful assassinations that removed commanders and shattered the structure of opposing forces. Without leadership, most armies collapsed quickly beneath the silent pressure that surrounded them. If an enemy refused to break, the 19th Legion simply vanished again into darkness, withdrawing not in retreat, but in preparation for the next unseen blow. From new directions and unexpected angles, they struck again and again, draining their enemies of strength while denying them every chance to regroup or seize the initiative. Many victories during the final years of unification were achieved in this hidden manner, and in numerous cases the Legion's hand remained unseen even after triumph had been secured. Only much later, after the Legion was united with its Primarch, would it step more openly into the light. Even then, the warriors who would become known as the Raven Guard rarely sought praise or public glory. The roots of this quiet discipline lay within the people from whom the Legion had first drawn its recruits. The Emperor gathered many of the earliest legionaries from across Old Earth, though most came from the Syriac tribes that roamed the Asiatic dust fields. These fierce yet technologically capable warriors waged endless battles against one another and against the powerful Indonesian bloc nearby, each conflict driven by the desperate need to control limited natural resources. When the Emperor and his Thunder Warriors finally subdued those tribes, the defeated peoples were required to surrender their firstborn sons to the gene forges that would create the earliest Legiones Astartes. Those same sons later returned as towering warriors who ensured that their once defiant kin remained loyal to the Imperium that had conquered them. The Syriac warriors proved well suited to the Emperor's design, though observers sometimes noted a harsh streak within their character. They could display ruthless cruelty when ordered into battle, and they often regarded those they considered weak with open disdain. Among their people, the defeated were watched carefully under a cold and unblinking gaze, and any sign of rebellion was crushed immediately before it could grow again. The 19th Legion carried this harsh vigilance forward into its own culture. Combined with the transformation of the Legiones Astartes, that inheritance became one of the Legion's defining traits, shaping the quiet and relentless warriors who would one day be remembered as the Raven Guard. One of the earliest campaigns in which the 19th Legion took part unfolded across the harsh lands of the Central Asiatic region of Old Earth. Much of this territory lay beneath the iron rule of a tyrant known as Kala Khan of Urs, whose armies had long dominated the wastelands through fear and violence. The surviving records of this campaign are few and often incomplete, though enough remains to reveal how the Legion fought and how its methods would later become a template for many of its future operations. At first, the warriors of the 19th Legion moved quietly through the region, studying the armies of Urs and marking the leaders, strongholds, and fragile points within their defenses. Small battle groups spread across the land and concealed themselves in positions from which they could strike when the order was finally given. When that moment arrived, the assault came with startling speed, cold discipline, and ruthless precision that left little chance for organized resistance. Kalakan's warlords were hunted down and slain in carefully coordinated strikes, and once their commanders were gone, the remaining armies quickly lost cohesion. The defeated forces were gathered together and driven into a vast prison camp established deep within the blasted heart of the Central Asiatic region. Stories from that war also speak of strange weapons wielded by Kalakan, devices shaped by psyker power that unleashed horrors difficult to fully describe. The young Legion bore the brunt of many of these assaults, and some warriors carried the scars of those encounters for the rest of their lives. A darkness lingered in certain veterans after the war had ended. Some later threw themselves into battle with reckless determination, seeking death in furious charges, while others eventually formed the solitary and feared Moradad orders within the Legion. As the unification of Old Earth continued and the Emperor's rule expanded outward, the 19th Legion earned many honors for its service. In time, the Legion was dispatched beyond Terra itself to take part in operations within the wider Sol system. When Imperial forces encountered a hostile Xenos presence entrenched among the settlements of the Jovian Range, the 19th Legion received the grim task of cleansing the moon known as Lysithea. Of that battle, almost no detailed records survive, leaving historians with little more than scattered hints and quiet speculation. What is known is that the Xenos infestation was completely destroyed and victory eventually claimed, though the cost proved terrible. The human settlers of the moon perished alongside large numbers of the Legion's own warriors, leaving the battlefield silent and scarred. After the conflict, many veterans who had fought upon Lysithea were suddenly withdrawn from service by the masters of the Emperor's gene forges. They were taken away and never returned to their legion, and no clear explanation of their fate was ever recorded. For many decades afterward, those who survived the battle wore upon their armor a small emblem that carried deep meaning. It showed an ancient Jovian rune crowned by the numeral of their legion, a symbol that marked both the victory they had achieved and the loss they had endured. By the later years of the Great Crusade, that symbol had largely vanished from ordinary armor, though it could still be seen etched upon the metal bodies of the Raven Guard's dreadnoughts. Among them stood Shade Captain Volterus, whose deeds had once played a decisive role in defeating the Xenos threat that plagued the Jovian settlements. The injuries he suffered during that final struggle were so severe that his broken body was placed within the armored sarcophagus of a mighty, furibundous dreadnought. From within that towering machine, he continued to serve the Legion for many decades more, until his long vigil finally ended upon the killing grounds before Gate 42. The 19th Legion came into existence during the final phases of the Unification Wars, much like many of the other Legiones Astartes. Yet nearly 2 full centuries would pass before it was finally reunited with the Primarch who had been created to lead it. During those early years, the Legion fought and grew without the presence of its gene-sire, shaping its identity through experience and the harsh traditions of its Terran origins. In contrast, the Luna Wolves had discovered their Primarch, Horus Heresy, very early in their history. With their gene father already among them, the warriors of that legion advanced swiftly into the first campaigns that would later be remembered as the beginning of the Great Crusade. Because of this difference, the 19th Legion often fought beside the Luna Wolves during those early conquests. Horus soon came to value the skills of the warriors drawn from the Asiatic dust fields, recognizing that their patient and watchful nature complemented the sudden violence favored by his own legion. When the Luna Wolves descended upon an enemy with overwhelming force, the 19th Legion was frequently already waiting in silent positions along the paths of escape. Their warriors closed every gap and cut down those who attempted to flee the storm unleashed by Horus and his hosts. Those few who managed to slip through the lines were pursued relentlessly until they were found and captured. The prisoners were then held beneath the cold gaze of the legionaries who guarded them, watched carefully until Imperial authorities confirmed that their worlds had accepted compliance. Over time, the reputation of the 19th Legion spread among those who resisted the Imperium's expansion. Their warriors possessed a strange ability to remain still and unreadable for long periods before shifting without warning into sudden and brutal action. That transformation from silent watcher to relentless attacker left many enemies unsettled long before the first strike ever came. During the earliest stages of the Great Crusade, Horus often requested that the 19th Legion accompany his Luna Wolves. In those distant years, many human worlds refused the Emperor's vision for a unified galaxy, and when diplomacy failed, the hidden blade of the 19th Legion descended swiftly and without warning. Yet, when a world accepted the Imperium willingly, the Legion's presence might never even be noticed. The warriors who had waited unseen simply withdrew again, leaving behind no trace that they had been there at all. As the years passed, Horus came to rely heavily on the Legion's talents. Some observers quietly remarked that he treated the 19th Legion almost as if it were another formation within his own 16th Legion, rather than a force destined to follow its own path. While the Luna Wolves gradually developed a distinctive culture shaped by their Terran heritage and the fierce gang traditions of Horus's homeworld Chthoniya, the 19th Legion remained much closer to the harsh customs of the Xeric tribes, from which many of its warriors had first been drawn. Their armor retained a muted gray color that reflected little light upon the battlefield. Before battle, some legionaries painted their faces with dust gathered from the Asiatic wastelands of their ancestral lands, a simple ritual that carried echoes of ancient tribal war customs. Among the Luna Wolves, these warriors came to be known by several names. Though two titles appeared more often than the rest, they were called the Pale Nomads and the Dust-Clad, descriptions that reflected both their ghost-like appearance and their lingering connection to the desolate territories of Old Earth. The Jinn seed carried within the Legion also began to reveal certain physical traits among its warriors. In some, their skin slowly lost its natural tone and became unnaturally pale, while others found their hair darkening until it resembled the deepest black of midnight. On rare occasions, the change extended even to their eyes, which could darken until the entire surface appeared black and reflective. The effect gave those warriors an unsettling and almost supernatural appearance that matched the silent and watchful demeanor they already carried into battle. Only after the Legion was finally united with its Primarch would these features fully spread throughout its ranks, shaping the appearance that later generations would associate with the Raven Guard. Corvus Corax, the Primarch destined to lead the 19th Legion, did not grow to adulthood beside the Emperor upon Terra. Like his brothers, he was torn away during infancy, when the ruinous powers of chaos breached the wards that protected the Emperor's hidden gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains. The infant Primarch's gestation chamber was seized and hurled through the depths of the warp until it emerged far across the galaxy. Eventually, that chamber came to rest deep beneath the surface of a barren and airless moon called Lycius, which circled the industrial world of Kievar. Kiava itself was a powerful forge world whose enormous manufactoria relied upon minerals drawn from the lifeless moon above. Vast numbers of slaves were forced to labor in those mines, extracting resources that fed the towering industries of the planet below. Corax was discovered far beneath the surface within a dark cavern chamber that lay beneath a massive glacier. His survival might have remained unknown for many years, if not for the chance arrival of Lycian miners who were pursuing a mineral seam through the ice and rock. Within minutes of the young Primarch awakening to consciousness, those miners uncovered the chamber that held him. Some later wondered whether the timing reflected simple chance or the quiet intervention of forces greater than mortal understanding. The miners carried the strange child away and concealed him among the slave population, hiding him from the harsh overseers who ruled the mines. Life upon Lycius was brutally controlled by armed guards who watched over a population made up of criminals, political dissidents, and workers condemned for failing to meet the relentless demands of Kievar's rulers. Like many of the Primarchs, Corax matured with astonishing speed, reaching adulthood in a remarkably short span of time. Those who protected him soon became convinced that he had been sent to deliver them from their suffering, and they named him with a word that meant both savior and liberator. Though vast knowledge had already been imprinted into his mind, the young Primarch still learned much from the prisoners who raised him. Many among them were political radicals who had once challenged the authority of the tech guilds that ruled Kievar, speaking openly of justice and human dignity in a society that tolerated neither. Corax promised these people that one day he would free them from the cruelty of their captivity. Yet his mentors urged patience and restraint, teaching him that open rebellion too soon would bring only ruin upon those who hoped for freedom. Under their guidance, the Primarch learned to watch his enemies carefully and to plan far into the future. His extraordinary abilities allowed him to remain constantly one step ahead of the brutal wardens who patrolled the mines. During those years, Corax also discovered a strange gift that seemed to accompany his presence. When he wished it, the eyes of observers simply failed to notice him, even when he stood directly within their line of sight. Through careful practice, he learned to move unseen through places no ordinary slave could ever reach, slipping past guards whose attention somehow drifted away from him at the crucial moment. Yet this ability had limits, for mechanical devices such as Auspex scanners could still detect his presence. It seemed that the minds of living observers were somehow influenced by the Primarch's will, allowing him to pass unnoticed where others would be immediately discovered. As Corax reached maturity, he quietly prepared the uprising that would one day shatter the rule of the tech guilds. Working through small cells of followers, he organized raids to steal weapons, gather ammunition, and sabotage critical systems within the prison complex. When the moment finally came, the rebellion unfolded with careful precision. The slaves rose in coordinated action across the moon, overwhelming their captors and seizing control of the prison facilities after a bitter and violent struggle. The fighting was harsh and chaotic, for many prisoners were hardened criminals whose past deeds could not easily be forgiven. Corax was forced to rely upon their strength in battle, though he demanded that they abandon their old crimes once their chains had been broken. It was during the final moments of this uprising, just as atomic bombardment began to fall upon the world of Kievar below, that the Emperor himself arrived to reclaim his lost son. Unlike many of the other reunions between the Primarchs and their creator, the Emperor came alone and departed alone on the following day. Father and son spoke together for long hours, though the content of their conversation has never been fully revealed. Some later believed that the Emperor shared knowledge of darker forces stirring within the warp, and of trials that would one day threaten the Imperium. Whatever was said, Corax seemed in later years to possess a quiet awareness of dangers that had not yet fully revealed themselves. Before departing, the Emperor left Corax to finish the task he had begun. The Primarch would complete the liberation of Kievar on his own before taking command of the legion that awaited him. The weapons available to him were those hidden by the tech guilds themselves. Vast stockpiles of atomic warheads and mining charges had been stored upon Lycius, thought to be safe from the slaves who toiled beneath their master's rule. As the guilds attempted to launch a desperate counterattack against the rebels, Corax gave the terrible command that would end the conflict. Using the powerful gravitational bond between moon and planet, he ordered a full atomic bombardment of Kievar's immense industrial cities. The fires that followed devastated the manufactoradia below, yet the destruction broke the power of the tech guilds and forced their surrender. In that harsh moment, Corax learned a grim truth of war, that sometimes the suffering of many must prevent an even greater catastrophe. With the guilds defeated, the world of Kievar was brought into the Imperium. The moon of Lycius was renamed Deliverance in honor of its liberation, and its people began the long process of rebuilding their shattered home. Soon afterward, the Mechanicum reclaimed authority over their ancient forge world and restored its industries for the Imperium's use. Upon the liberated moon, the great black tower that had once housed the garrison of the prison became something entirely new. It rose again as the Raven Spire, the fortress monastery from which the warriors of the newly named Raven Guard would one day watch the stars. By the time Corvus Corax assumed command of the 19th Legion in 1922 of the 31st millennium, the Great Crusade had already advanced for well over a century, and the Raven Lord quickly reshaped the Legion to reflect the methods he had learned during the long struggle on Lycaeus. Stealth, patience, and sudden speed became the guiding character of their campaigns, woven together with a constant watchfulness that defined the Legion's new identity. In these early years, Corax worked steadily to erase much of the old culture that had grown within the 19th Legion before his arrival, especially the colder and harsher traditions carried by Terran warriors of the Xeric tribes. The Legion had long served in roles of repression and occupation, and within some of its veterans, Corax saw echoes of the Kiavahan enslavers who had once ruled his home world. Several high-ranking officers were therefore displaced or reassigned away from command, among them Lord Arcusfall, who had guided the Legion as its master for 3 decades before the coming of their Primarch. Under Corax's guidance, the Legion refined its art of war to remarkable levels. Their methods were distilled into simple battle mantras that encouraged quiet observation, followed by sudden and precise action. In the strategic simulacra often used by the Primarchs to test their thinking, Corax even managed to defeat robot Guilliman several times, relying on unusual formations and experimental troop types that Guilliman had never before encountered. Among these forces were early forms of the Moritet, warriors whose methods unsettled even the disciplined mind of the Ultramarines Primarch. Yet Guilliman was a quick learner, and once he adapted his tactics, the Raven Lord was never able to claim victory over him again. At the same time, the Legion pursued technological innovations that suited its distinctive methods. From the great forges of Mars came equipment carefully modified to serve stealth and speed. When the Thunderhawk gunships spread widely among the Legiones Astartes, the Raven Guard secured their own variant, known as the Shadowhawk, an aircraft fitted with advanced systems that rendered it nearly invisible to most augurs. Alongside it appeared another craft called the Whisper Cutter, a light, open-framed flyer driven by a gravitic impeller that could release 10 legionaries into a war zone in near silence, their arrival almost impossible to detect. These unusual machines did not come from the Mechanicum itself, but from the guild artificers of Kievar, master craftsmen who had once served the great technical guilds of that world. Drawing upon strands of machine knowledge unfamiliar to the wider Mechanicum, they created devices and systems tailored specifically for the Raven Guard. Over time, the Legion's tech marines were taught the principles behind these creations. Though it was quietly speculated that the jealous lords of Mars might have condemned the Kievarans as outcasts had they not enjoyed the patronage of a Primarch and his Legion. As the Great Crusade continued its steady expansion across the stars, Kievar itself became firmly established within the growing Imperium. Its industrial output never equaled that of a true Forge world. Yet, with the guidance of Martian tech priests, its manufactoria produced vast quantities of equipment and a variety of specialized machines designed for the Raven Guard. The guild artificers guarded their most precious secrets closely and resisted surrendering them to Mars, maintaining a fierce independence that had sustained them through the dark centuries of the Age of Strife. In truth, the only authority they recognized was that of the Raven Guard themselves. Among the Mechanicum's many domains, Kievar maintained a notable relationship with only one world, Griffon 4. The details of that arrangement were never widely recorded, yet the repeated presence of the Titans of Legio Griffonicus fighting beside the Raven Guard suggested that some reciprocal pact bound the two powers together. During these years of expansion, one campaign stood out among the Legion's many operations. Far out in the northern reaches of the Ultima Segmentum, Leva Istvan system, a region whose worlds had preserved an industrialized human civilization that endured through long millennia of isolation. Scout vessels of Corax's expeditionary fleet discovered this society upon the world of Istvan III, and its stability made it a valuable prize for the Imperium. The culture of Istvan III possessed deep traditions of local mysticism and religious practice, and its people had grown accustomed to independence. When first contacted by the advancing forces of the Great Crusade, they hesitated and eventually refused compliance with the imperial truth. Because the system possessed such strategic and industrial importance, the Imperial War Council ordered that its worlds must be brought into unity with the Imperium, though they insisted that overwhelming destruction be avoided so the planet's resources would remain intact. The responsibility for achieving this careful compliance fell upon Corax and the Raven Guard, whose reputation for surgical strikes and measured warfare suited the task. Black-hulled strike cruisers appeared without warning above Istvan III, and the Legion moved swiftly to dismantle the planet's military infrastructure while seizing the centers of government. The defenders of the world were disciplined soldiers who resisted fiercely despite facing the transhuman warriors of the Legiones Astartes. Fighting continued until the last elements of the most aggressive faction were destroyed in the Valley of Redarth. Afterward, an Isvanian delegation approached Corax and the 800 companies of Raven Guard who formed his legion, kneeling before the sable-armored warriors as a defeated foe. They were welcomed into the Imperium as fellow citizens, and they swore to accept the teachings of the imperial truth. Although the Remembrancer Order had not yet been imposed upon the legions by the Council of Terra, a civilian contingent remained behind to begin the slow integration of Istvan's population into the culture of the Imperium. Vardas Brawl was appointed as the world's governor, tasked with maintaining compliance and dismantling the traditional religious structures that had shaped Istvanian society, which were in truth a form of chaos worship devoted to Slanesh. The center of this new imperial authority was established in the sprawling proto-hive known as Gry Vanak, whose name in Imperial Gothic translation meant the Coral City. Neither Corax nor his warriors could know that many years later they would return to this same system, not as envoys of unity, but as avengers pursuing a traitor. Soon after Horus Lupercal was declared War Master during the triumph at Ulanor, the Raven Guard were recalled from distant operations near the Ghoul Stars and ordered to join several other legions under his direct command. The Occam Sothos cluster, once brought into compliance by the Luna Wolves, had descended into violent rebellion when its population fell victim to strange Xenos parasites that matured within the eye sockets of their hosts. These parasites eventually gained crude control of the afflicted population, linking their victims into a collective consciousness, guided by a group of dominant hosts known as the Unsighted Kings. Determined that the worlds he had once conquered should not slip from imperial control, the War Master swore an oath that the cluster would be reclaimed whatever the cost. Horus devised a swift and ruthless strategy meant to destroy the Unsighted Kings while preserving the cluster's valuable infrastructure for future repopulation. A rapid victory would also demonstrate to his brother Primarchs that the Emperor had chosen wisely when granting him authority over them. The plan called for the main strength of 4 Legiones Astartes to converge upon the fortified refuge of the Unsighted Kings. The Luna Wolves, the Space Wolves, the Iron Warriors, and the Raven Guard were to crush the last resistance in a final assault. After the outer worlds of the cluster were subdued within a matter of weeks, Horus summoned his brothers to a council where the final stages of the campaign were laid out. During this meeting, Corax learned that his legion had been assigned a frontal assault against the heavily defended bastion known as Gate 42. The Raven Lord spoke openly against the order, arguing that such an attack would waste lives unnecessarily when a more subtle strategy might achieve the same end. He proposed that his legion conduct a series of feints to draw away defenders, allowing the remaining legions to strike the weakened walls. Perdurabo of the Iron Warriors answered with harsh words, accusing Corax of seeking to avoid battle and of failing in his duty as a Primarch. Tension rose so sharply between the two that only the intervention of Lemon Russ prevented violence within the council chamber. The Wolf King urged Corax to heed the authority the Emperor had placed upon the War Master and to allow his bitterness to become the fire that would carry the coming battle forward. With that counsel lingering in his thoughts, Corax returned to his legion and prepared them for the assault before Gate 42. Knowing that the more savage Terran-born companies would advance without hesitation, he placed many of them at the forefront of the attack, choosing especially those captains most willing to fulfill the War Master's design. The battle that followed became known as one of the darkest moments in the history of the Raven Guard. Assault companies were torn apart as they advanced beneath relentless fire from the defenders. When the attack faltered and the breach seemed impossible to achieve, Corax himself led the desperate charge, his presence driving the Legion forward until the walls were finally broken and the gate captured. The execution of the unsighted kings was claimed by Horus, and with their deaths, the strange parasites lost control over the population they had enslaved. The cluster was restored to Imperial rule, yet the cost of victory weighed heavily upon the Raven Guard. Millions of infected hosts were left crippled in mind and body, while thousands of legionaries had fallen before the shattered fortress. When the campaign ended, the 19th Legion stood reduced to only 80,000 warriors, making it the smallest of all the Legiones Astartes. Corax withdrew his legion from Horus's command and swore never again to fight at his side. The slaughter at Gate 42 carried another quiet consequence as well. Many of the Terran-born officers who had once served under Horus before the coming of Corax perished during the assault, and with their deaths, the War Master lost much of his remaining influence within the Raven Guard. These same Terran warriors had often belonged to the secret warrior lodges that had begun spreading among the legions, and their loss caused those lodges within the 19th Legion to fade away almost entirely. Some critics later claimed that Corax had deliberately placed these companies in the most dangerous positions so that his own vision for the Legion would prevail without opposition. Because of this outcome, the Raven Guard would later be largely spared the wave of rebellion that spread through many legions by means of those hidden lodges. In the years that followed, the Legion participated in a prolonged engagement known as the Scalland Campaign, fought across a region of space where remnants of the broken Eldari species still clung to their ancient worlds. The conflict served as a testing ground for a new pattern of power armor created by the Mechanicum, at that time provisionally designated as Mark V. Earlier trials had already been conducted with small numbers of this armor among the Iron Warriors and the Salamanders, and both legions had criticized its lighter plating when compared with earlier designs. To determine its true worth in battle, the Mechanicum arranged for the Raven Guard to test the first 1,000 suits during the campaign. Some observers suspected that rivals within the Legionis Astartes command structure, particularly those aligned with Perturbo, expected the weakened Raven Guard to fail with the new armor and thereby condemn the design entirely. Instead, the Legion adapted quickly, using the armor's enhanced agility and sensitive auto-senses to hunt the Eldari through the lush seed worlds of the sector in a relentless pattern of sudden strikes and swift withdrawal. Their success proved decisive. The Eldari forces were driven from the region, and the Imperium claimed its fertile planets. In the aftermath, the Mechanicum approved the armor for full deployment and incorporated many improvements suggested by the Raven Guard during their trials. Soon afterward, the design entered large-scale production upon Mars. In honor of the Legion that had proven its value, the armor became known as the Corvus pattern, eventually designated as Mark VI power armor. Its widespread distribution began only months before the galaxy was shaken by Horus's rebellion against the Emperor. During the terrible days of the Horus Heresy, the Raven Guard were drawn into the catastrophe remembered as the Drop Site Massacre upon the world of Istvan V, where what had begun as a loyalist assault suddenly collapsed into betrayal as several Space Marine legions turned against their brothers under the banner of Horus Lupercal. In the chaos of that sudden treachery, the Raven Guard fought beside the Salamanders and the Iron Hands, yet the ambush closed around them like a tightening ring of steel, and the battlefield quickly became a place of relentless crossfire and collapsing hope. The losses suffered there were beyond anything the 19th Legion had ever endured, for the force that had once numbered many tens of thousands of Astartes was shattered until only a few thousand survivors remained scattered across the blasted ground of the Urkel Depression. As the situation worsened and the traitor legions pressed their attack from every direction, Corvus, Corax, and Vulcan briefly debated what little chance of survival remained, though their views differed on how the Loyalists should escape the disaster unfolding around them. Vulcan believed that the surviving warriors should withdraw toward their dropships and attempt to hold defensive ground against further assault, while Corax believed that the battle was already lost and that any attempt to stand and fight would only lead to total annihilation. Unable to agree, Corax ultimately turned away from his brother and ordered the Raven Guard to withdraw, hoping that at least some fragment of his legion might escape the slaughter consuming the battlefield. Not long after this decision was made, a devastating strike of atomic artillery fell upon the Primarchs' position, and although Corax survived by what could only be called the grace of the Emperor, the fate of Vulcan was unknown to him at that moment. At the same time, the second wave of traitor legions fell upon the Loyalists in earnest, and the Iron Hands who had come to Istvan V were cut down without mercy as the massacre reached its most brutal phase. Elsewhere, upon that broken field, the Primarch Ferrus Manus confronted Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, and the two former brothers fought in a titanic duel whose bitterness echoed the betrayal of the entire war. The struggle ended in tragedy when Ferrus Menus was defeated and beheaded by the brother he had once trusted above all others. While these events unfolded, The Raven Guard themselves were driven into fierce combat against the Word Bearers, whose Primarch Lorgar advanced alongside Gorfaeron and the Chaplain Erebus at the head of their forces. In the midst of that savage fighting, the Word-Bearers unleashed the Gal Vorpak, possessed Astartes who hurled themselves toward Corax in overwhelming numbers. Yet even surrounded by such abominations, the Raven Guard Primarch cut them down with relentless skill. Seeing his favored warriors falling beneath Corax's blows, Lorgar stepped forward and confronted the Raven Guard Primarch himself. Their duel was brief and uneven, for Corax quickly gained the advantage over his brother, whose strengths lay more in study than in war, and he prepared to end the traitor's life for his betrayal of the Emperor. That final stroke never fell, because Conrad Kersey of the Night Lords intervened and forced Corax into another brutal confrontation. Kersey soon gained the upper hand against the already exhausted Primarch, though Corax managed to escape death by launching himself skyward with his jump pack and vanishing into the air above the battlefield. The surviving loyalists were left surrounded and outnumbered as the traitor legions closed in around them, and the remaining Raven Guard and Salamanders fought stubbornly in the knowledge that their resistance could delay the inevitable slaughter only for a short time. Even so, they continued to hold their ground until the arrival of Angron and Mortarion brought even greater devastation, while the towering titan called DS E-Ray strode through the carnage beside the traitor legions. Soon afterward, Horus himself entered the battle at the head of his elite Justaeran Terminators, and the slaughter that followed shattered any remaining hope of escape for most of the Loyalist warriors. The Iron Warriors destroyed the dropships that might have carried the survivors away, and the Loyalist vessels still orbiting the planet were largely destroyed by the overwhelming strength of the traitor fleet. Yet in spite of these terrible odds, some of the Raven Guard managed to slip through the tightening cordon of traitor forces, escaping into the surrounding highlands where shadows and broken terrain offered a narrow chance of survival. Their flight was not without danger, for at one point an Iron Warrior's armored column nearly discovered them, though the Raven Guard struck swiftly from ambush and destroyed the vehicles before the enemy could raise the alarm. For many days, the scattered survivors endured relentless pursuit across the harsh landscape of Istvan V, while Corax struggled to understand the full scale of the disaster that had destroyed his legion. After many weeks had passed and no word arrived from the Iron Hands or Salamanders, he ordered his warriors to hold position upon Lurgan Ridge while he slipped away alone to reconnoiter their original drop site. Using his innate psychic abilities to avoid detection, Corax moved unseen through the heavily fortified territory now held by the traitor legions, though his private purpose was not only reconnaissance, but also the sorrowful hope of finding the fallen bodies of his Gene sons among the ruins of the battlefield. His search brought him no answers, and so he returned to the dwindling survivors who continued their desperate retreat through hostile territory. At last, the Raven Guard found themselves driven against the edge of a windswept mountain where the salt plains stretched behind them and the armies of the World Eaters advanced from the valley below. Angron led the charge personally, and his warriors climbed the slopes in a frenzy of violence while their tanks and artillery roared from below. berserk assault seemed certain to wipe out the last of the Raven Guard. Yet just as the final clash drew near, the sky suddenly filled with the thunder of descending aircraft. Missiles and incendiary bombs tore through the advancing ranks of the World Eaters, while blazing strikes of plasma fell from orbit and carved burning scars across the battlefield. Black dropships bearing the insignia of the Raven Guard descended through the smoke and flame, their landing legs striking the ground as their ramps opened to receive the stunned survivors of the shattered Legion. The warriors of the Raven Guard approached those dropships with disbelief, for the vessels belonged to a desperate rescue mission led by Commander Bronne, who had remained behind on Deliverance while the Legion fought at Istvan V. His arrival came just in time, and the surviving Raven Guard quickly embarked aboard the waiting craft before breaking through the encircling fleets and leaving the enraged World Eaters behind upon the planet's surface. Unknown to Corax and his warriors, the Alpha Legion had already begun a far subtler campaign during the chaos of the massacre, altering their own operatives so they resembled fallen Raven Guard Astartes and inserting them among the survivors as they fled across Istvan V. Balfarius Omegon had been told by a secret alien organization known as the Cabal that the 19th Legion would soon receive a powerful asset, and that allowing the Raven Guard to survive would eventually place that asset within reach of the Alpha Legion. By impersonating Horus himself, the Alpha Legion Primarchs manipulated a pursuing fleet of World Eaters and halted their attack upon Brandne's rescue ships, ensuring that the Raven Guard would escape the slaughter and eventually carry the valuable genetic secret they intended to steal. Corax never learned how Brandne had arrived at Istvan V, though the captain quietly attributed his decision to mysterious prophetic dreams reported by Marcus Valerius of the Therion cohort. Once the Legion escaped the disaster and regrouped, Corax took stock of what remained of his shattered command. Including Brandne's garrison forces from Deliverance, the Raven Guard numbered fewer than 4,000 Astartes of all ranks and disciplines, a fragment of the mighty Legion that had once marched to war. In order to restore some sense of structure among the survivors, Corax reorganized the remaining companies into several formations suited to the resources still available. The majority of the Legion became the Talons under Captain Agapito, while the assault specialists and several ancient dreadnought veterans formed the Falcons under Aloni Dev, and the scattered bike squads, land speeders, and aircraft crews were united under Captain Solero Ann and named the Hawks. The Apothecarian had suffered terribly during the massacre, and only 7 apothecaries remained alive within the Legion. Among them was Vincente Six, a warrior who had spent only 15 standard years in the Apothecarian, yet was appointed chief apothecary by Corax himself. Haunted by the destruction of more than 75,000 of his warriors, and consumed with thoughts of vengeance against Horus, Corax led his surviving legion back toward Terra, where he hoped the Emperor might aid him in rebuilding what had been lost. After several delays and disagreements with Rogaldorn and Malgador the Sigillite, Corax eventually communed psychically with the Emperor, who was then engaged in a constant struggle against chaos within the warp and within the damaged webway project beneath the Imperial Palace. During that communion, the Emperor revealed truths that few beings in the Imperium had ever known, speaking of the Webway Project, of the true nature of chaos, and of the deeper reality behind the war that had consumed the Imperium. He also revealed that the genetic foundations of the Primarch Project had not been destroyed as most believed, and that samples of the original undifferentiated gene stock still remained hidden beneath the Imperial Palace. With the Emperor's permission, Corax led a small expedition beneath the Himalayan mountains, where guarded laboratories held the ancient genetic material that had once been used to create the Primarchs themselves. Accompanied by Mechanicum specialists, and watched over by custodians who served as the Emperor's overseers, Corax recovered the preserved gene stock and returned with it to Deliverance. There, after several weeks of work by Corax, Chief Apothecary 6, and the Mechanicum Ganador Nexon Orlandrias, a remarkable breakthrough was achieved when stable gene seed derived directly from the Primarch genetic source was successfully extracted. The purity of this material allowed an accelerated program in which hundreds of aspirants were implanted and developed far faster than normal. The resulting warriors were strong and capable, though inexperienced, and they were given the name Raptors before being placed under the command of Captain Bran Ney, who served as master of recruits for the Legion's rebuilding efforts. Their first battle came quickly when they struck a word-bearer's listening station and destroyed it, a victory that briefly suggested the Raven Guard might recover from their losses. Yet while the Legion celebrated this fragile success, the Alpha Legion patiently advanced the hidden plan that had begun on Istvan V. Their agents stirred rebellion among the ancient tech guilds of Kievar, while a larger Alpha Legion force gathered nearby, carefully disguised in Raven Guard colors and markings so that their movements would confuse both allies and enemies alike. At the same time, the infiltrators hidden within the Raven Guard worked with adepts of the Dark Mechanicum to sabotage the precious Primarch gene stock, contaminating it with a virus infused with demonic essence. Even the Alpha Legion agents did not fully understand the nature of the corruption they were spreading, believing that their allies would later extract the virus once the gene stock was safely captured. When the next group of recruits underwent implantation, the results were catastrophic. Thousands of newborn warriors developed grotesque warp mutations, and many had to be imprisoned as their bodies twisted into unstable forms that could scarcely wield a weapon. Corax refused to abandon them, declaring that even in their mutated state, they were still his sons, and that he would search for a way to cure them. Yet the harsh reality was clear, for only a tiny fraction of the recruits retained genomes stable enough to become true Space Marines. As these tragedies unfolded within the Legion, the Alpha Legion moved toward the final stage of their plan. Omegon himself had been manipulating events upon Kievar, and while the rebellion spread across the Forge world, the infiltrators seized the original Primarch gene stock and the knowledge that accompanied it. Their second objective nearly succeeded as well, for they intended to destroy the Raven Guard's remaining gene seed entirely. That destruction was prevented only because the mutated warriors, acting on the orders of the dying Chief Apothecary Vincente VI, intervened to preserve what remained of the Legion's future. After the turmoil upon Kievar, Corax permitted the mutants who were still capable of fighting to serve within the Raptor formations, allowing them to take part alongside the rest of the Raven Guard in the first counterattack against the traitor forces. That campaign included a successful assault against an Emperor's Children garrison on a nearby world, where the battered Legion proved that it still possessed the skill and determination that had once made it feared throughout the Imperium. Even so, the attempt to rebuild the 19th Legion through accelerated methods had clearly failed, and Corax came to believe that the desperate shortcut he had chosen had been a grave mistake. With great reluctance, he abandoned the project and ordered that the Legion would once again grow only through the traditional process of transforming human aspirants into Space Marines through many long years of careful genetic alteration and training. This decision meant that the Raven Guard would not be able to field the numbers needed to fight the traitor legions in open battle during the remainder of the war. Yet the Legion did not withdraw entirely from the struggle, for Corax chose another path that suited both their limited strength and their natural talents. Instead of meeting the enemy head-on, the Raven Guard began striking quietly at the distant arteries that sustained Horus's war effort. They hunted convoys carrying troops and weapons, sabotaged supply depots and orbital shipyards, shattered occupation garrisons, and freed the laborers forced to serve the traitor war machine. Each transport destroyed meant fewer soldiers reaching the future siege of Terra, and every lost shipment meant fewer weapons placed in the hands of the enemy. Over time, these quiet strikes became the guiding philosophy of the Legion, a way of fighting that sought not the glory of decisive battles, but the steady erosion of the traitor cause. When the Horus Heresy finally ended and the great legions were divided during the Second Founding, the Raven Guard were left weakened and scattered by the disasters they had endured. Much of their strength had to be rebuilt slowly during the long years that followed, a period remembered as the time of rebirth, when the chapter struggled to regain its place among the defenders of the Imperium. Because of their reduced numbers and limited equipment, the Raven Guard refined their reliance on stealth, covert operations, and small formations capable of striking swiftly without heavy support. Even many centuries later, the chapter continued to favor these methods, and their relative lack of heavy vehicles and the newest armor patterns reflected the hardships that had shaped their past. After the defeat of Horus and the end of the Great Civil War, Corvus Corax accepted the decision to divide the Space Marine legions into smaller chapters, recognizing that the vision proposed by Roboot Keelyman would help prevent another catastrophe like the one that had nearly destroyed the Imperium. For the Raven Guard, this new era began under the shadow of sorrow, because their Primarch carried deep guilt for the terrible choices he had made while trying to save his legion. In the aftermath of the war, Corax personally granted the Emperor's peace to each surviving mutant created by the failed acceleration program, bringing a quiet end to warriors who had once hoped to serve beside their brothers. The weight of that duty drove him into seclusion within the Raven Spire on Deliverance, where he remained alone for a full Terran year while seeking forgiveness from the Emperor who had ascended to the Golden Throne. When he finally emerged from those chambers, Corax departed Deliverance aboard a vessel bound for the Eye of Terror, leaving behind a chapter that would never again see its Primarch. His fate was never recorded, and the last words spoken before his departure were remembered simply as a quiet farewell carried into the darkness. In the centuries that followed his disappearance, the gene seed of the Raven Guard began to deteriorate slowly, a problem that some believed might have been connected to the desperate genetic practices of earlier years. Several of the specialized organs unique to Space Marines no longer functioned reliably, and every attempt to correct the damage ended in failure. Because of this decline, the chapter increasingly relied upon gene stocks preserved on Terra by the Adeptus Mechanicus during the Second Founding. The scarcity of viable genetic material forced the Raven Guard to become unusually cautious in selecting and training new recruits. Aspirants often spent long periods within the 10th Company serving as Scout Marines or Vanguard Marines, gaining experience and proving their worth before they could take their place among the chapter's full battle companies. Even with these limitations, the Raven Guard refused to slow their campaigns against the enemies of the Imperium, often fighting long wars while operating with dangerously low numbers. Though they favored stealth and indirect warfare, the warriors of the Raven Guard remained capable of launching fierce assaults whenever the situation demanded it, trusting their skill, discipline, and initiative more than the brute strength of overwhelming numbers. In the era before the opening of the Great Rift, much of the Raven Guard's strength was deployed along the distant eastern fringe, where the growing power of the Tau Empire had begun pressing against Imperial territory. During the hard fighting of the Perfectia campaign, the chapter suffered a heavy loss when their chapter master, Corvus Heresy, fell in battle. Leadership then passed to the former Shadow Captain Gaven Shrike, a commander whose mastery of stealth and sudden strikes reflected the traditions that had long defined the Raven Guard. After assuming command, he chose not to concentrate the chapter in one place, but instead divided its strength into several smaller forces that could operate unseen across distant regions of the Imperium. These scattered formations were dispatched across the Segmentum Tempestus and the Segmentum Pacificus, carrying out covert operations whose larger purpose Shrike has never openly revealed. Yet those who have faced the Raven Guard in these campaigns have come to understand that their commander acts with careful intention, and that even the quietest movement of his chapter is part of a larger design. For the warriors of the Raven Guard, shadows have always been a quiet companion that follows them wherever they move, shaping both their appearance and the way they wage war. Their brooding demeanor and pale complexion seem to belong naturally to dim places and silent approaches, and over long centuries this closeness to darkness has become a defining part of who they are. It is not merely preference or style, but something born from necessity, because the chapter has often fought with numbers that could never be wasted through reckless exposure. To endure, they learned to move unseen and strike from places where the enemy could not easily look, and this patient reliance on stealth slowly became reflected in the armor they wear. Their power armor is jet black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, and upon it appear the symbols of the black bird whose name the chapter carries. Among these markings, there is one sign that speaks quietly of long and honored service. Veteran battle brothers sometimes bear the raven claw upon the right shoulder, where the black symbol is painted across a field of white. Those who wear it are seasoned in the ways of guerrilla warfare, able to shift their actions as the battlefield changes, while remaining constantly aware of the smallest movement around them. Another decoration appears in the form known as the Raven Calvaria, shaped like the skull of a bird and worn by many battle brothers across the chapter. Some suspend it from a chain that rests around the neck, while others fasten it so that it hangs from the right shoulder blade, where it sways gently with every step of the warrior who carries it. The Raven Guard follow a system of markings that largely reflects the traditions laid down in the Codex Astartes, though over time they have allowed a few small variations to develop within their ranks. Yet even these markings are not always worn in the same way, because warriors who operate far behind enemy lines sometimes conceal or remove their heraldry entirely, choosing anonymity over recognition when survival depends on remaining unseen. In much earlier ages, during the long campaigns of the Great Crusade and the terrible years of the Horus Heresy, the Raven Guard Legion displayed a far richer array of symbols and decorative elements across their armor. But after the second founding, when the Legion had already been reduced to a shadow of its former strength by the horrors of the Drop Site Massacre, the chapter chose to return to a far simpler pattern of markings that continues to define them in the present age. Their armor remains black as it has long been, and the chapter badge appears upon the left shoulder plate, where the stylized white raven stands against a field of sable. The trim of this shoulder plate remains black as well, maintaining the quiet uniformity that the chapter prefers. On the opposite shoulder plate, the symbol of the warrior's squad specialty is displayed, whether battle line, close support, fire support, veteran, or command. Among these, the sign used for fire support differs from the standard icon and instead takes the shape of a stylized explosive blast, marking those who bring devastating force to distant targets. The trim of the right shoulder plate quietly indicates the company to which each warrior belongs, following the traditions of the Codex Astartes. White signifies the first company, gold the second, red the third, and green the fourth, with further colors continuing the pattern among the companies beyond. The designation of the squad appears as a low Gothic numeral upon the left knee plate, offering a simple mark of belonging that can be recognized even at a glance. Among officers and certain veteran leaders, further distinctions may appear. Some force commanders, along with high-ranking veteran officers and sergeants, wear shoulder plates of pure white, and in some cases the helmets and even the armor that covers their arms share that same pale color. Rank itself is often shown through a quiet language of helm studs, color patterns, and the iconography carried on the right shoulder plate. These visible signs are supported by heavily encoded auspex signals that can be read by the auto-senses of power armor, allowing identification even if the markings must be hidden. Within this system, sergeants are recognized by the skull placed at the center of their helm, while veteran sergeants wear a white helm bearing that same skull symbol. Lieutenants display a red and white stripe along their helms with a skull at its center, accompanied by an ornate design upon the right shoulder blade. Shadow captains are marked by a white helm bearing the skull symbol as well, along with a similarly ornate pattern upon the right shoulder blade. The badge of the Raven Guard is simple and unmistakable, reflecting the quiet clarity with which the chapter presents itself to the galaxy. At its center appears a stylized white raven, its pale form standing sharply against a field of deep black. This symbol rests upon the armor of the warriors who carry the name of the chapter, a silent mark that remains visible even as they move through shadow and silence. In the long years after the drop site massacre of Istvan V, the genetic heritage of the Raven Guard never truly recovered from the desperate measures taken to rebuild the Legion. Corax had driven the process forward with urgency, seeking to restore his shattered warriors as quickly as possible, yet the methods used during that dark period left deep scars within the Legion's gene stocks that would never fully mend. Much of their original genetic reserve was lost or damaged beyond repair, and in the centuries that followed, a large portion of the chapter's remaining gene material had to be drawn from stores kept upon Terra. Even with this support, the path to becoming one of the Raven Guard remained more difficult than it was for many other chapters, and many aspirants failed early in their transformation before their bodies could endure the demanding process. Because of this, the chapter's numbers grew only slowly, shaped by steady losses during training and the fragile nature of their remaining gene seed. Over time, the degeneration continued quietly within their implanted organs, and several of the enhancements that once defined a Space Marine no longer functioned as they once had. Among the Raven Guard, there are implants that never properly develop at all, and some that fail entirely after implantation as zygotes. Warriors of the chapter no longer possess the mucranoid organ, the adaptation that allows other Space Marines to endure extremes of heat or cold, and even the empty silence of the vacuum beyond the stars. They also lack the Becher's gland, the organ that grants many Astartes the ability to spit a corrosive venom when battle demands it. These absences are accepted without complaint, for the Raven Guard have long learned to endure the limits placed upon them by their wounded inheritance. One mutation, however, shapes the appearance of every warrior who bears their gene seed. The melanochromic organ, which normally allows a Space Marine's skin to adapt to the changing strength of distant suns, behaves differently within the Raven Guard, slowly draining the skin of its pigment, no matter what color it once carried. As the years pass, a warrior's flesh becomes pale and white, while hair and eyes darken steadily until they turn the deep black once seen in their Primarch, Corvus Corax, whose shadow still lingers quietly within the blood of his sons. The Raven Guard follows the teachings of the Codex Astartes in many respects, though their manner of war has always taken on a different shape, shaped quietly by limited numbers and a deep preference for the patient arts of covert shadow warfare. Rather than gathering their strength for frontal assaults or drawn-out struggles of attrition, they move with careful purpose behind enemy lines, studying weaknesses and waiting for the precise moment when a sudden and coordinated strike can break the fragile points in an opponent's defense. Their attacks often arrive like a sudden storm, brief and violent, striking locations of great tactical importance before fading away again into the shadows. Charging recklessly into an enemy formation holds little appeal for the warriors of this chapter, and their commanders instead guide their forces with restraint and deliberate calculation. In this approach, they stand apart from chapters whose traditions celebrate the fury of direct assault, such as the Blood Angels, whose warriors often meet the foe face to face in close and furious battle. The Raven Guard place deep trust in their scout marines, who move silently through hostile territory and spend long periods observing enemy movements. These scouts search patiently for hidden weaknesses, mapping out positions and identifying safe drop locations so that the rest of the chapter's warriors may descend with precision when the time arrives. Within the chapter itself, companies and captains often operate with a strong sense of independence, and it is uncommon for the entire Brotherhood to gather in one place. Separate companies move across distant regions of the galaxy, answering calls for aid from Imperial commanders wherever they may be found, sometimes acting even without the direct instruction of the chapter master. To outside observers, this independence can appear unusual, and some have quietly questioned whether such freedom of action weakens the chapter's unity of command. Yet those who know the Raven Guard understand that this method reveals not disorder, but remarkable discipline, and a profound trust placed by the chapter in the judgment of its captains. In battle, their methods often involve swift maneuver engagements, where assault marines, inceptors, land speeders, and attack bikes move quickly through the field, harassing enemy formations and destroying carefully chosen targets rather than engaging the full strength of an opposing force. While these fast-moving elements create disruption, battle line squads descend from the sky aboard Thunderhawk gunships, and ancient dreadnoughts arrive in thunderous drop pods to lend their heavy presence where the strike demands it. Heavy armored vehicles are rarely seen among their ranks, and even when such machines exist, they are fielded sparingly. Instead, the Raven Guard favors an infantry-heavy force that moves lightly and adapts quickly, relying once again on their scout marines, who often operate alone for long stretches of time, even by the demanding standards of the Adeptus Astartes. Overhead, the skies frequently fill with the rumble of aerial assets, as wings of gunships and descending drop pods provide rapid movement and swift response whenever the situation changes upon the battlefield. At times, entire strike forces composed of Vanguard Marines gather for deep infiltration missions, warriors drawn from companies across the chapter who don their Mark X Phobos power armor before slipping quietly behind enemy lines. In these moments, the Raven Guard fights as something between mechanized infantry and a collection of elite special forces, blending small unit tactics with their long tradition of covert operations. Among their commanders, lightning claws are a favored weapon, and it is common to see the warriors of a command squad equipped with these talons, while their jump packs carry them swiftly across the battlefield. Kill team operations fit naturally into the traditions of the chapter, and over the centuries they have developed a quiet reputation for assembling small groups of hand-chosen specialists whose actions can shift the course of an entire war. Moving unseen through darkness and confusion, these warriors strike with careful precision, and many alien tyrants or hidden heretic relays have fallen beneath the sudden arrival of shadowed killers clad in black power armor, their talons already drawn. Among the Raven Guard, long traditions endure quietly, shaped over centuries by the culture of their distant homeworld. Many of their rituals carry echoes of Kievar itself, and one of the most visible of these customs can be seen in the small fetishes worn by the warriors of the chapter, known as Corvia. During the long and demanding initiation of a young neophyte, there comes a moment when the aspirant must withdraw into a meditative trance, undertaking a solitary spirit quest among the forests of Kievar. In those shadowed woods live small avians that move quickly through the branches, creatures that are watchful and easily startled. The neophyte must learn to approach them without sound, guided by patience and by the careful teachings of the Shadow Masters who train within the towers of the Raven Spire. For many solar months, the young aspirants practice the quiet discipline known as Wraith-Slipping, slowly learning how to move through darkness and foliage without disturbing even the smallest creature nearby. Only when their skill has grown subtle enough can they approach the small ravens unnoticed, catching them gently but firmly with bare hands before ending their lives with a swift motion. The tiny skulls of these birds become the Corvia themselves, small tokens suspended on chains from the belt or armor of a Raven Guard warrior. Each one carries quiet meaning, a sign of the honor earned by the one who wears it. When a battle brother falls in combat, another will recover the Corvia from the fallen warrior, keeping it with him in battle so that the honor of the dead continues beside the living. In time, those skulls are returned to Kievar, where they are placed carefully into the soil of the chapter's homeworld. Until that return becomes possible, they remain carried into battle, silent reminders of loyalty and memory. The claiming of a fallen warrior's Corvia is accompanied by another solemn duty. The body of the dead battle brother is stripped of armor, weapons, and the symbols of the chapter, while the precious gene seed is harvested so that the legacy of the warrior may continue. Once the chapter has taken what must be preserved, the remains are left behind, offered to the carrion birds that circle above the battlefield. In matters of belief, the Raven Guard hold a quieter view than many other chapters. They do not surround the Emperor with the fervent devotion found elsewhere among the Adeptus Astartes, instead seeing him as a distant master of the galaxy and the founder of the Imperium, a figure worthy of respect yet far removed. Their loyalty often turns instead toward the memory of Corax, whom they regard as a leader who faced harsh decisions when necessity demanded them. The path he laid out continues to guide the chapter, and after every conflict, the Raven Guard study the records of battle with patient attention, searching for lessons that can refine their methods. Because of this careful study, much of their tactical doctrine has grown from reflection and examination rather than simple tradition. Their officers value initiative and clear tactical thinking as much as personal strength in combat, and they favor swift, precise strikes over long campaigns of siege and attrition. This preference for sudden and surgical action often sets them apart from other chapters. To the Raven Guard, some of their cousins among the Adeptus Astartes appear heavy-handed or blunt in their approach to war, and this difference of philosophy has created quiet tension, especially with warriors such as the Blood Angels. Across the long history of the Imperium, many Space Marine chapters have endured for countless centuries, and those of the first founding trace their lineage back to the original legions that fought during the Emperor's Great Crusade. With such deep histories stretching far into the early age of the Imperium, rivalries have formed naturally between different chapters, sometimes remaining little more than harsh words and competition, yet at other times growing into open hostility. The bitter distrust between the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels is widely known among the Adeptus Astartes, though it is far from the only example of tension between ancient brotherhoods of warriors. Among the Raven Guard and the White Scars there exists another rivalry, one that has endured for many centuries and continues to color every encounter between them. No single moment can easily be named as the origin of their hostility. Instead, it lingers across a number of remembered battles, each one leaving behind frustration, anger, and suspicion that slowly deepened the divide between the two chapters. One such conflict was the assault on Hive Lin Mei, an engagement whose memory still stirs resentment among warriors on both sides. Another moment that feeds the rivalry is remembered as the last march on the Sapphire Worlds, a campaign whose echoes remain strong within the traditions of each chapter. Yet the most bitter memory among them is known as Operation Kronos. During that grim episode, a respected chaplain of the Raven Guard fell under the domination of an enslaver, and the tragedy unfolded while a nearby White Scars force might have been able to intervene. Events such as these, together with many other incidents spoken of quietly among the chapters, have nurtured a deep and enduring hostility. The warriors of the Raven Guard and the White Scars now regard one another with barely restrained loathing, and few believe that this old rivalry will fade any time in the long future of the Imperium. Among the Raven Guard, even the smallest ritual carries quiet meaning, and one such tradition begins deep within the forests of Kievar, where tiny ravens move restlessly through the dark branches. During their initiation, every recruit is sent alone into those woods, learning patience and silence for many long solar months until they can approach one of the wary birds closely enough to seize it gently in their bare hands and end its life with a swift motion. From these small creatures come the skull totems known as Corvia, delicate relics that hang from a warrior's belt on thin chains and sway softly as he walks into battle. Each skull speaks of honor earned through patience and discipline, and when a battle brother falls, a comrade gathers the Corvia and carries them forward, so that the warrior's honor continues beside the living until the small bones can be returned to Kievar and laid quietly within the soil of their distant home. Other relics carry the memory of their vanished Primarch, whose presence lingers in artifacts shaped for him long ago. The sable armor was crafted by the Emperor's own artificers, a suit of refined power armor that shielded the Raven Lord from attack, while quietly masking his presence and distorting the senses of nearby enemies. Alongside it stood the weapons and devices known collectively as the Panoply of the Raven Lord, a set of deadly tools that included lightning talons capable of tearing through the heaviest armor and an energized whip that could lash outward with startling speed, recalling the chains of tyranny once broken by their master. His flight pack, the Corvidine Pinions, was said to be a relic from the lost age of ancient technology, altered carefully so that it answered perfectly to the Primarchs' own demanding needs. All of these treasures were lost when the Raven Lord disappeared, leaving behind only quiet stories and the lingering sense that such tools once moved through battle like shadows given form. Some relics remain, their origins uncertain even among the warriors who bear them today. The Armor of Shadows is one such mystery, a suit whose plates slide across one another without the faintest whisper, while its power pack murmurs softly like distant wind. Around the wearer drifts a shifting cowl of darkness that moves like slow smoke when he walks and gathers thickly around him whenever he stands still, allowing Raven Guard hunters to close upon their prey unseen before striking, with silent certainty. Another weapon, known as Ex Tenebris, appears at first to be a finely crafted bolter, yet its intricate blast cowl muffles every shot so completely that the weapon seems to speak only in whispers. Rumors within the chapter suggest that Corax himself forged it long ago as a gift for his troubled brother, the Night Haunter, though the tides of the Horus Heresy turned the legions against one another before that gift could be given. Since that time, the weapon has passed quietly between Raven Guard heroes who carry it into battle, where terror and confusion spread among the enemy without warning. In the armories of the chapter rests a long and elegant sniper rifle known as Nihilus, whose sleek barrel and carefully worked stock reveal the skill of a master artificer from some earlier age of the Raven Guard. Tradition holds that it must be carried by the finest marksmen within the 10th Company, and though its inner workings remain a guarded mystery, the rounds it fires strike like darts of living shadow that collapse violently against armor with powerful implosive force. A single clean shot has been known to tear a Chaos Space Marine apart or cripple even a heavy battle tank, a quiet testament to the weapon's strange design. Other relics are bound to the service of living warriors. The Raven Helm is an ancient treasure that cloaks its wearer in a faint halo of shifting darkness, subtly warping his outline and confounding even the most sensitive enemy sensors until he appears little more than a moving shadow among deeper shadows. In the hands of a Raven Guard battle brother, the effect becomes uncanny, leaving enemies uncertain whether they have truly seen him or only imagined a figure passing through the gloom. At present, the helm is carried by Shadow Captain Solak, who moves through battle with the calm certainty of a hunter long accustomed to unseen paths. One relic carries a story of sacrifice remembered with quiet respect among the chapter. Long ago, the warrior Sundek Korvad gave his life to save his company captain, and the small scrimshawed raven skull he wore upon a chain was retrieved from the battlefield and honored as a blessed charm. Since that day, The Raven Skull of Corvad has been granted by the Reclusiarch to brothers judged worthy of bearing it, and whenever it is lost during battle, the chapter commits great effort to recover it so that the memory of that sacrifice is never abandoned. Among the devices that carry the warriors of the Raven Guard through the air, some stand apart from ordinary machines. The jump pack called Raven's Fury appears similar to many others within the armory, though its craftsmanship is unusually refined, and a closer look reveals miniature plasma engines in place of the ramjets used by common designs. Such technology lies beyond the reach of most artificers of the Imperium, granting the wearer sudden bursts of speed when he surges forward into battle, while the pack's advanced machine spirit drives eagerly toward the charge. The chapter also preserves weapons tied to its greatest champions. The lightning claws known as the Raven's Talons are carried by Shadow Captain Gavin Shrike of the 3rd Company. Their ancient blades said to have been crafted by Corax himself upon deliverance after the Raven Guard withdrew there following the drop site massacre of Istvan. These claws can slice through even Terminator armor with effortless precision while retaining all the brutal force expected of such weapons. Another relic blade known as the Shadow in the Sky curves like the talon of a great hunting bird, perfectly balanced and keen enough to move with an almost living grace whenever a Raven Guard warrior takes it in hand. Paired lightning claws called Swift Strike and Murder carry a similar spirit of predatory speed, their edges flashing so swiftly that even heavily armored enemies can be torn apart before they fully understand the danger closing around them. High above the battlefield, the relic jump pack known as the Wings of the Raven roars quietly to life, its long, curved air intakes and oversized thrusters marking it as a powerful variant recovered and restored by generations of patient tech marines. This black artifact has carried many Raven Guard warriors through the skies of distant war zones, including fierce battles fought in the Canis Salient of the Jericho Reach, where its powerful thrust helped them close the distance against the disciplined fire lines of Tau warriors waiting below. During the years of the Great Crusade and the long darkness of the Horus Heresy, the fleet of the Raven Guard moved quietly across the stars, a scattered host of vessels bound together by duty and shadow. Among them sailed the mighty battleship Shadow of the Emperor, once the proud flagship of the Legion as it guided the 27th Expeditionary Fleet through distant regions of space. That great vessel met its end above the burning world of Istvan V, where betrayal unfolded during the drop site massacre, and where the traitor battleship Terminus Est, commanded by the first captain, Silas Typhon of the Death Guard, destroyed it in orbit. The loss of that flagship became a wound remembered for generations, and the Raven Guard have long carried the quiet determination to avenge it. In the wake of that catastrophe, another vessel stepped forward to carry the burden of command. The battle barge Avenger, under the leadership of Commander Brane Nev, left the world of deliverance despite the orders given by the Primarch Corax, who had placed him there as custodian of the Legion's home. Brane chose instead to risk everything, leading a daring rescue that gathered battered survivors from the blackened surface of Istvan V. In the days that followed, the same ship carried the Primarch himself to Terra to meet with the Emperor, and later returned him safely to Deliverance. When Corax resolved that the 19th Legion would return to the war against Horus, the Avenger became the new flagship of the Legion fleet. Other ships carried their own quiet histories through the stars. The battlecruiser Sabalis Liberatus escaped the chaos above Istvan V, only to vanish into the warp for nearly 4 solar years before emerging near the world of Galaspar at the edge of the Veiled region. Within its silent hull, the surviving warriors of 3 loyalist legions had entered suspended animation to preserve energy, waking later to discover that they were alone and cut off from all support. When a patrol aligned with the traitors approached, the ship's crew fought back, defeated their attackers, and boarded the captured vessels. With salvaged parts, they repaired their damaged cruiser and set out on a long and uncertain voyage that would eventually lead them toward the Segmentum Solar and the distant throne world of Terra. Across many campaigns, other ships played their part in the quiet war of the Raven Guard. The strike cruiser Rushinisus served Captain Corvidi during the raid on Castorel Novem, escorted by the frigates Oneantha Primus and Oneantha Secundus. The swift vessel, known as the Plutonian Shore, survived the orbital battle above Istvan V and later fought beside the shattered legions under the Iron Hands commander, Shadrach Medusan, though it was grievously damaged during the Battle of Erisak when vast decks were opened to raging plasma fire, costing the lives of hundreds of legionaries and wounding many more. Some ships were remembered for the missions they undertook in the shadows. The Raven's Valor and the Triumph were among the vessels that joined Commander Brandnez's flotilla to rescue their beleaguered brothers from Istvan V, carrying them away from a world already lost to treachery. The strike cruiser Shadow Strike fought beside the steadfast and the wrathful Vanguard under Captain Norris of the Imperial Fists, striking swiftly at enemy convoys during the reconquest of the Gretharoch Reach. The Steadfast itself, commanded by Commander Aloni, became feared by traitorous supply fleets because its unusual shield technology allowed it to appear suddenly among freighters and cargo haulers before vanishing again into the darkness. Even smaller vessels carried the same spirit of stealth and persistence. The light cruiser Fearless served the Raptor contingent of the Legion and acted as the flagship of Lieutenant Navarref during the long Civil War. Its stealth systems allowed it to patrol deep into contested regions and conduct infiltration missions, and the fierce temper of its commander ensured that the ship rarely lacked for battle. Another vessel, the strike cruiser Second Shadow, carried a name that echoed the Legion's lost flagship and served the 5th Company during the 13th Black Crusade, until it too was destroyed by the dreaded Terminus Est above the shrine world of Cathor. Not all ships remained in loyal hands after the disaster at Istvan V. At least 2 battle barges of the fleet, grand cruisers of the Dagon class whose names were never recorded, were captured by the Sons of Horus in orbit above that same doomed world. In the years that followed, they appeared again during the infamous treachery at Port Maw, where they were forced to serve as living shields that protected Horus's own flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. As the war between brother legions continued to spread across the galaxy, during the age of the Great Crusade, the fleet of the Raven Guard possessed a rare and unusual advantage, a form of void shield technology known as Reflex shields that had been developed on the Forge world of Kiavar, the planet around which the Moon of Deliverance slowly turned. This technology reshaped the way the Legion's warships could move through hostile space, allowing them to approach unseen and strike with the sudden precision that matched the character of the 19th Legion. A normal void shield used the strange power of the warp to redirect incoming attacks, bending projectiles and energy away from the vessel through careful gravitic manipulation. The reflex shields of the Raven Guard altered this familiar process in a subtle but powerful way. By adjusting the modulation of the warp drive cores that powered the shield systems, the technology redirected the field inward rather than outward. Matter and energy emitted by the ship itself were displaced, and even the faintest electromagnetic radiation that normally revealed a vessel's presence could be scattered away into the void. To distant augers and scanning arrays, a ship using this system seemed to fade slowly into the background of the stars. Observers watching with the naked eye would see a faint shimmer as light reflected strangely from the hull, and then the image of the vessel would soften until it vanished completely, leaving only the silent darkness of space. Through this method, Raven Guard ships could drift close to their targets while remaining almost impossible to detect, waiting patiently before striking with sudden force and withdrawing again into concealment. Yet the same system carried a dangerous weakness that could not easily be overcome. Because the void shield generators were committed to sustaining the cloak, a vessel using reflex shields had little protection against direct physical attack. The generators required time to shift from cloaking mode back to their defensive state, leaving the ship exposed for several uneasy minutes during the transition. There were other limits as well that even the Primarch Corax tried for many years to overcome without success. The cloak could only hide a limited amount of energy, and so a ship's reactors had to operate at reduced power while the system remained active. This meant slower travel through space and weaker sensor capability, a quiet compromise accepted by the Legion in exchange for the gift of near invisibility. Whether the Raven Guard chapter still possesses this ancient technology in the long years after the heresy remains uncertain, and the truth of it lies hidden among the many secrets carried by their fleet as it moves silently between the stars. The 19th Legion was founded according to the Emperor's long vision for the armies of humanity, and its warriors were arranged in a careful structure that moved from chapters to battalions to companies and finally into squads. Most legionaries felt their strongest bond at the level of the company, because companies were the formations most often trusted to act independently across distant worlds and uncertain battlefields. From its earliest days, the Legion encouraged responsibility among its lower commanders, allowing those closer to the fighting to decide how and when to act. Officers trusted their sub-commanders to read the moment and respond without waiting for distant approval. This habit of independence came from the old Xeric tribes of Terra, whose people had long fought enemies far more numerous than themselves, learning to survive through stealth, misdirection, and unconventional methods. Their units were often smaller than those of other legions, yet each formation was tightly bound together and capable of surviving alone for long stretches of time. These transhuman warriors were trained to take what they needed from the land around them, and when necessary, they drew their supplies from the spoils of defeated enemies. Even as the Legion grew and accepted the many engines of war created for the Legiones Astartes, its smaller formations remained the core of its character. The Raven Guard mastered the use of tanks, heavy artillery, assault vehicles, and towering war machines, yet their favored style of battle still revolved around swift strikes, careful flanking maneuvers, and the quiet approach of stealth whenever such methods were possible. Reconnaissance formations were particularly common within their ranks, so common that many legionaries were trained to fight both as line warriors and as scouts who moved ahead of the main force. In time, the line between tactical squads and reconnaissance units began to fade, as both fought with similar tools and similar habits of silent movement. Among these warriors, there were also those known as Moritat, individuals considered extreme even by the stern standards of the Syriac tribes. These legionaries accepted missions from which they were rarely expected to return, undertaking acts of assassination or sabotage far from the eyes of those who recorded the Imperium's victories. The remembrancers who traveled with the fleets usually saw only the aftermath of such campaigns, the quiet work that secured those victories remaining hidden in shadow. After the Council of Nicaea commanded the legions to abandon the use of psychers, the Raven Guard obeyed and disbanded their librarians. Many former librarians returned to line companies as communication specialists, while others may have served within seeker units or among the Legion's more secretive operatives. Whether they always obeyed the decree during distant independent missions was never recorded, and many of those individuals later perished amid the bloodshed of the Urgal Depression during the Dropsite Massacre. When Corvus Corax assumed command of his legion, he brought with him the lessons of the slave uprisings on Lycius. The tactics he had learned there blended easily with the legion's existing methods, strengthening their preference for swift, subtle warfare. Corax soon elevated many commanders who had fought beside him during those rebellions, men who had once been freedom fighters and who later endured the transformation into Astartes warriors. As time passed, the influence of deliverance within the Legion grew stronger, particularly after the costly struggle known as the Battle of Gate 42. Only a few Terran veterans remained in positions of high command. Corax himself preferred a loose chain of authority, and he valued honest counsel from those around him rather than demanding distant reverence. During the uprisings on Lycius, his allies once insisted that he be protected by a bodyguard, fearing that assassins might seek his life. Though he disliked the idea, Corax allowed it for the comfort of those who followed him. When he finally joined his legion, that bodyguard remained with him and became known as the Shadow Wardens, an honor guard said to be always present even when unseen. Stories spread that none could avoid their watchful gaze except Corax himself, and such tales added to the growing belief that the Raven Lord could slip through shadow as easily as any whisper in the dark. Perhaps because of his past as a guerrilla leader, Corax often preferred to operate alone or with only a handful of chosen warriors. Among these companions were the Mortathon, called the Shadow Masters, whose gene-gifted abilities allowed them to move unseen, through the minds of their enemies. It was not unusual for the Primarch to conduct reconnaissance personally before a battle, quietly studying the ground where his legion would soon fight. At times, he even led small infiltration forces deep behind enemy lines, striking directly at the heart of an opposing army, while the larger Raven Guard formations drew attention elsewhere. Despite their reputation for stealth, the Raven Guard maintained vast reserves of heavy armor and war engines supplied by the Mechanicum. Entire battalions of armored vehicles stood ready within the Legion's arsenals, and many more machines waited within fleet reserves to be assigned when needed. When the Legion deployed to Istvan, they brought these engines with them, sending armored formations sweeping along the base of the Lurgon Ridge in a wide flanking maneuver against the Sons of Horus. Wings of swift attack speeders and jet bikes moved ahead of the slower tanks, isolating enemy strongpoints and harrying them without rest. Then the betrayal came upon the Urgal Depression as the Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, and Word Bearers revealed their treachery. Many Raven Guard armored units were cut off from their Primarch and ambushed while struggling to return to his side, and the dark sands of that battlefield swallowed much of the Legion's strength. Very few of the Raven Guard's heavy armored formations escaped the slaughter that followed the drop site massacre, although those that did helped hold back the enemy pursuit in the bitter hours that followed. Later, many of those surviving vehicles were abandoned and their crews reassigned to fight on foot because the Primarch judged that every living legionary mattered more to the future of the Legion than any engine of war. Long after the battle ended, it became clear that the traitor legions had reclaimed many of the vehicles left behind upon the black sands of the Urgal Depression. Some machines had been crippled by strange Mechanicum weapons that unleashed devastating neutron radiation, killing even transhuman crews while leaving the armored hulls themselves largely intact. Such discoveries seemed to reveal the cruel foresight of Horus and the careful design behind his treachery. The Raven Guard had always relied upon a wide range of aircraft and voidcraft, from swift gunships to the immense Stormbird dropships that carried warriors from orbit to battlefield. Many of these craft carried advanced stealth systems designed by the guilds of Kievar, allowing them to slip deep into hostile territory before releasing their passengers into war. During the assault on Istvan, most of the Legion's orbital craft were committed to transporting warriors from fleet to surface. Thunderhawks and Stormbirds made repeated journeys between orbit and ground, delivering thousands of Astartes to the unfolding battle. When the betrayal began, these same vessels were at their most vulnerable, many standing upon the landing zones while warriors disembarked into the smoke and dust. The Iron Warriors then opened fire with their immense artillery, and the devastation was absolute. Only a handful of Thunderhawks and Storm Eagles escaped the destruction, while every Stormbird upon the field was consumed by fire and ruin. When the remnants of the Raven Guard were finally withdrawn from the battlefield near the edge of the Gular Salt Plains, it was those few surviving craft that carried them away from certain death. The courage and skill of the rescue force led by Commander Branne Nev allowed Corax and several thousand of his sons to survive the catastrophe and continue the war against Horus. Before these events, however, The Legion had been operating far from the Istvan system, conducting campaigns in the distant Thetos-Croton binary star system. Only when Rogal Dorn managed to reach Corax through astro-telepathy did the Raven Guard learn of the terrible treachery unfolding within the Istvan system. Corax ordered his fleet to depart immediately, yet before leaving, he commanded that a portion of the Legion remain behind to guard Deliverance against any possible counterattack. None of the Legion's senior officers wished to miss the coming confrontation with the traitors, and so lots were drawn to determine who would remain behind. A force of roughly 1,000 legionaries under Commander Branne Nev returned to Deliverance, accompanied by Imperial Army allies known as the Therian Cohort. Elsewhere across the Imperium, other Raven Guard forces were scattered among distant expeditions, small garrisons, and wandering fleets. Many of these detachments were composed of Terran-born veterans of the old 19th Legion. One such fleet operated under the command of Shade Lord Arkasval, a former leader of the Legion, who had been assigned that role directly by Corax when he assumed command. The fate of Fall and his distant fleet was never recorded, and Corax made no attempt to recall them. When the Raven Guard finally committed themselves to the battle at Istvan, they did so with nearly their full strength. The Legion had already suffered heavy losses during the Battle of Gate 42 and stood as the smallest of the Space Marine legions, yet they believed they would fight alongside loyal brother legions. Instead, the betrayal shattered them. Nearly 75,000 Raven Guard perished during the Drop Site Massacre, and within 98 days, the Legion's numbers had fallen to only a few thousand survivors. When distant detachments and garrison forces were counted, the entire Legion could muster little more than around 4,000 Astartes. For the first time in their history, the Raven Guard stood broken and diminished. Corax refused to withdraw from the war, and he reorganized the remnants of his legion so that they could still fight effectively despite their reduced strength. The old chapter structure could no longer be maintained, so he divided his surviving warriors according to their combat roles. Tactical companies became known as Talons, assault companies were called Falcons, and the fast squadrons of vehicles and air support took the name Hawks. In the difficult campaigns that followed, this structure proved flexible and resilient, allowing the Raven Guard to shift their strength quickly against enemies far larger than themselves. Among the most secretive formations within the Legion were the warriors known as the Mor Dathon, an elite brotherhood created by Corvus Corax during the years of the Great Crusade. These legionaries served as exceptional scouts and infiltrators, and many believed that they carried a faint echo of their Primarch's strange gift for moving unseen through the thoughts of others. Those rare individuals possessed the ability known as Shadow Walk, allowing them to deny their presence to anything with a mind and pass almost unnoticed through guarded places. They fought with chainswords and bolt pistols, though sniper rifles, shotguns, and rarer weapons such as Volkite arms were often carried when the mission demanded it. In battle, the Mor Dathon communicated through a quiet language called Stalk Arcot, a series of sighs and whispers so subtle that they blended into the wind and the distant sounds of the environment. Only a small number of Deliverance-born Astartes displayed the genetic quirk that allowed this strange ability, and those warriors were gathered into the hidden brotherhood of the Shadow Masters. Even within the Raven Guard, their existence was known only to the Primarch and a few trusted apothecaries. Corax often employed them for the most dangerous reconnaissance or sabotage missions, sending them far behind enemy lines where stealth mattered more than numbers. Over time, the relentless demands of these operations began to reduce their numbers. Many were scattered across the galaxy when the drop site massacre erupted, and only a few dozen survived the catastrophe that followed. These last warriors continued to serve the Emperor until attrition slowly claimed them all, and it remains uncertain whether any descendants of the Mordathon exist in the distant age of the 41st millennium. Another formation within the Legion was known as the Deliverers. These warriors wore the heavy tactical dreadnought armor favored by Horus during the years when he acted as patron to the 19th Legion before Corax was discovered. Many Raven Guard disliked the slow and cumbersome nature of the cataphracti pattern armor, yet some companies became skilled in close assault tactics while wearing it. These armored warriors earned the name Deliverers among their brothers. After Corax returned to command, he seldom called upon them directly. Most were assigned to distant Crusade fleets, and those who remained near the Primarch were unleashed only when an enemy deserved nothing less than complete destruction. The bodyguard that had once protected Corax during the slave uprisings of Lycius followed him when he joined his legion. These warriors formed the honor guard known as the Shadow Wardens, ever watchful around their Primarch. Stories spread that they were always present even when unseen, and that none could escape their observation except Corax himself. Within the Raven Guard, there also existed a darker condition among certain veterans who had endured extreme stress in battle. Some warriors abandoned all instinct for survival and fought with a grim determination to destroy as many enemies as possible before their own deaths. Among the Terran-born warriors, this state was called Ash-Blind, while those from Deliverance spoke of the Sable brand. The condition was said to reveal itself when the warrior's eye darkened entirely to black. Those who survived their furious battles sometimes recovered, though others continued to seek death in combat without regard for tactics or orders. Corax eventually shaped this dangerous impulse into a weapon. Warriors afflicted with the Sable brand were gathered into units known as Shadow Killers, and they were sent into the fiercest assaults where their relentless fury could break enemy lines. Finally, there were the Dark Fury Assault Squads, warriors trained for brutal decapitation strikes against enemy leaders. Rather than stalking quietly through shadows, these legionaries descended directly into the chaos of battle, wielding lightning claws modeled after those of their Primarch. They leapt from transports such as the Darkwing pattern Storm Eagle, or from open-framed Whisper Cutter craft, dropping from great heights before igniting the retro thrusters of their jump packs. Their leaders, known as Choosers of the Slain, engaged the chosen target, while the rest of the squad cut down any guards who dared interfere. When such strikes succeeded, the result was often immediate confusion among the enemy, as commanders fell and chains of authority collapsed amid the sudden violence. After the turmoil that followed the drop site massacre on Istvan V, the Raven Guard reorganized themselves along the guiding structure of the Codex Astartes, though their interpretation of its principles would always remain somewhat different from that of many other chapters. The Legion had been left with too few resources to restore itself fully, and the survivors were forced to continue their campaigns using older weapons and earlier patterns of power armor that still remained in their stores. Over the long years that followed, this necessity shaped the character of the chapter, and even in the present day, the Raven Guard maintain a far greater number of ancient suits of armor than most of their brother chapters. Those warriors who are entrusted with such relics tend to regard the honor with quiet reverence, believing that to wear these ancient suits is a sign of the Primarchs' distant favor resting upon them. Within the chapter's ranks, the titles of command also carry the echo of Corax's will. Senior officers are known as Shadow Captains, and the chapter master bears the title Master of Shadows, a naming tradition that Corax himself is said to have ordered before he vanished from the Imperium's sight. The Shadow Captains who lead the companies are known for a fierce independence of judgment, and the Raven Guard seldom gather together as a single unified host. Instead, individual companies operate with a high degree of autonomy, answering calls for aid from Imperial commanders scattered across the galaxy, sometimes even without the direct sanction of their Master of Shadows. To some observers in other Space Marine chapters, this unusual freedom of command has raised doubts about the chapter's cohesion. Yet many seasoned commanders recognize that such fluidity can only function where discipline is already deeply rooted. Long before these traditions took their modern shape, during the days of the Great Crusade and the dark years of the Horus Heresy, the Raven Guard Legion had already organized its warriors into specialized companies. Among them were formations such as the Falcon Assault Company and the Talon Tactical Company, which were structured in ways that would later resemble the reserve companies of Codex-compliant chapters. Among the Raven Guard, it is common to see the distinctive beaked helmets of older patterns of power armor, relic designs that date back to marks used long before the present era. Suits from the 4th through the 6th marks remain in steady service, with the beaked helmet of the 6th pattern appearing especially often among the chapter's warriors. This reliance on earlier armor designs is not a matter of preference alone, but the lingering consequence of the devastation suffered on Istvan V during the drop site massacre in the earliest days of the Horus Heresy. So many of the Legion's resources were lost in that disaster that the Raven Guard were forced to rely heavily upon the older suits and equipment preserved in their reserve armories, and the chapter has carried that inheritance forward through the centuries. Even now, the proportion of ancient armor within the chapter remains noticeably higher than among many of their brother chapters, a quiet reminder of the hardships that shaped them. Yet the Raven Guard are not without means to sustain their wars. Their homeworld of deliverance and the towering fortress monastery known as the Raven Spire possess an industrial strength that approaches that of a small forge world. Because Deliverance circles the true Forge world of Kievar, the chapter can draw upon its vast resources when necessary, ensuring that the Raven Guard rarely find themselves without the tools required to continue their long campaigns. The Raven Guard have long carried a burden within their gene seed, a lingering instability that traces its origins back to the experiments once conducted by their Primarch Corax. Much of the chapter's genetic material was damaged beyond recovery, and as a result, many of the viable samples now used to create new warriors must come from carefully preserved stocks held upon Terra by the Adeptus Mechanicus. This dependence slows the cycle of recruitment, since the Raven Guard must wait for purified gene seed to be delivered before new aspirants can undergo transformation. And even then, fewer neophytes survive the process than is common among other chapters. Before the coming of the Primaris Space Marines, this shortage of warriors left the chapter perpetually under strength, its ranks never quite as full as they might have been. Those who are chosen to attempt the trials are drawn almost entirely from the hardy mining populations of Deliverance, men accustomed to hardship and darkness beneath the surface of their world. Within the shadowed halls of the Raven Spire, these recruits are trained by the chapter's Shadow Masters, whose instruction focuses not only on strength and endurance, but on the subtle arts of stealth, infiltration, and sabotage that define the Raven Guard way of war. Despite the immense size and power of a Space Marine's armored form, the neophytes are taught to move through darkness with silence and patience, learning how to pass from one pocket of shadow to another without betraying their presence. This discipline of silent movement is known within the chapter as Wraith-Slipping, a technique cultivated slowly through endless practice within the twisting labyrinths beneath the fortress monastery. At first, the recruits learn to soften their movements with simple means, such as rags and packed earth, and in time, they progress to acoustic dampeners and refined control of their own movements, until even the heavy mechanisms of power armor can be guided quietly through the dark. These practices form part of the chapter's secret rites of silence, and every Raven Guard must master them before he can stand fully among the initiates. Each warrior ultimately discovers his own way of moving unseen, learning to sense the empty spaces between sounds and occupy those spaces without disturbance. Through repeated trials, the Raven Guard test these abilities constantly, for without practice, the delicate skill of Wraith-Slipping begins to fade. Only by embracing the shadows completely can a warrior pass through them without notice, and only by experiencing the tension of being hunted can he refine the art into something approaching perfect concealment. Even so, the Raven Guard understand that such stealth is never absolute, yet the most experienced warriors, especially the Shadow Captains, move with such affinity for darkness that they can seem almost indistinguishable from it. Like other Space Marine chapters, the Raven Guard maintain a librarius composed of psychers who have been chosen and trained to channel the immense forces of the warp. Across the Imperium, different chapters select their librarians in different ways, sometimes drawing candidates from their own recruiting worlds, and at other times receiving gifted psychers who have been trained through the Scholastica Sagana. Whatever their origins, most of these spikers are instructed according to the ancient traditions preserved within the Codex Astartes, and the Raven Guard largely follow these same teachings. Their librarians are trained along those established paths, though a few small traditions unique to the chapter remain woven into their discipline, shaping how they wield their powers. Among the psychic techniques known only to the Raven Guard librarians is a power remembered as Corax's ingenuity, through which the librarian reaches into the depths of the warp and draws strength from it. When this ability is invoked, the psyker becomes suffused with that energy, embodying the ideals associated with Corax and radiating that strength outward, strengthening the resolve and martial skill of the warriors fighting beside him. Another of their abilities is known as the Curse of the Raven, a focused malediction cast upon a single enemy, whose mind begins to erode beneath the pressure of warp energies. As those unseen forces gnaw at the target's thoughts, they expose flaws in his defenses, weaknesses that the Raven Guard's warriors can swiftly exploit in the chaos of battle. A third manifestation of their psychic art carries the name, the Unkindness of Deliverance, and through it, the librarian shapes warp energy into the form of a dark flock of ravens. These spectral birds surge toward the enemy in a black cloud, and the librarian may direct them to overwhelm a single foe or scatter them across several opponents, leaving those caught within the swirling flock temporarily blinded and disoriented. In the long chronicle of the Imperium, the story of the Raven Guard is not written in the thunder of great hosts or the banners of triumphant parades. Their legacy is carried instead through quieter victories, in the sudden collapse of rebellions that never fully understood what hunted them, and in the fading echoes of enemies who realized too late that they had already been marked. From the desolate Asiatic dust fields of old Earth to the distant battlefields of the Great Crusade, the warriors of the 19th Legion learned the same patient discipline that had sustained their ancestors. They watched, they waited, and when the moment came, they struck with precision that shattered armies far larger than their own, even when their numbers were broken by betrayal and tragedy during the Horus Heresy. That quiet philosophy of war endured. The trials that followed would shape the Raven Guard more deeply than any victory. The devastation of Istvan V reduced their legion to a shadow of its former strength, and the desperate attempts to rebuild through the Primarch gene stock brought consequences that haunted Corvus Corax for the rest of his life. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, the Raven Guard refused to abandon their duty. They turned to the methods that had always defined them, striking unseen against Horus's supply lines and weakening the traitor cause through relentless sabotage. In the centuries after the heresy, the chapter rebuilt slowly from the scars of those dark years. The disappearance of Corax left them without the guiding presence of their Primarch, and the slow deterioration of their gene seed forced them to tread a careful path in preserving their future. Yet the warriors of the Raven Guard endured, refining their reliance on stealth, small unit tactics, and the quiet precision that had first defined them during the Unification Wars. From the shadowed halls of the Raven Spire on Deliverance to the distant war zones of the Eastern Fringe, their descendants continue to fight with the same watchful patience that once guided the legion of Corvus Corax. Under commanders such as Kaivan Shrike, they move unseen across the stars, appearing only when the Imperium's enemies have already stepped too far into the light. So the Raven Guard remain what they were always meant to be, not the loudest champions of the Emperor's will, nor the most celebrated of his legions, but the silent blade waiting in darkness. Where rebellion grows, where traitors believe themselves hidden, and where enemies think the Imperium blind to their schemes, the Raven Guard are already there, watching, waiting, and when the moment is right, striking without warning from the shadows.